you ever wondered at what point in time did fish evolve into land-dwelling organisms? What was the transition species? Where and how was it discovered? Hi, my name is Tracy and I'm in the class of 2023, and today I'll be talking about tetrapods, Tiktaalik, and the evolution from sea to land animals. So I'd like to begin our tour today by taking a look at this bony fish fossil, and this fish was from 175 million years ago. And if we take a look at its long, sinuous backbone here, as I'm tracing, we can see that it's composed of individual vertebrae, which are these little nodes here, and we can see how tightly packed they are together. So we can see that they're nearly on top of each other here, and this allowed the backbone to bend in an undulating manner, sort of like this, enabling the fish to swim. However, there was clearly a point in time where fish evolved into land-dwelling organisms. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. And this is where tetrapods come into the picture. Tetrapods were one of the first land-dwelling vertebrates to evolve after fish during the late Devonian period. And in order to be able to live on land, they acquired a vast variety of strategies that allowed them to move, breathe, and reproduce outside of any body of water. Some of these developments included well-developed limbs, as well as new ways to breathe with developments such as lungs or gills. Another new innovation of tetrapods was a much more rigid assembly of vertebrae on their backbone in order to compensate for gravity. So if we take a look here at the first drawer under tetrapods, here, we can see that the vertebrae of tetrapods was much larger and much more sturdy than the fish vertebrae that we just saw. So I'd like to point out Ichthyosaurus communis and take a look at its vertebrae, and we can see just how large and how sturdy it is, especially compared to the small fish vertebrae that we just saw. And what's interesting in this drawer is that right next to it we can see the cross-section of the exact same vertebrae, and here, tracing along the vertebrae, we can also see on a 2D plane just how large it was. I'd also like to take a look at the vertebrae here of another early tetrapod called Dimetrodon. And we can see here that this vertebrae was unique because attached to it was a long, elongated spine. And so Dimetrodon lived in the early Permian era, around 270 million years ago. And it's commonly mistaken for a dinosaur because of its appearance, but it's actually part of a group called the non-mammalian synapsids, or what's more commonly referred to as mammal-like reptiles, and so Dimetrodon is actually more closely related to mammals than modern reptiles. And the most distinct feature of Dimetrodon was a sail-shaped neural spine composed of many vertebrae just like the one we just saw, and so combined they would create a sort of fan-shaped or sail-shaped neural spine on its back. And scientists early on believed that the spine was used for thermal regulation to help Dimetrodon cool and heat its body. However, more recent studies suggest that the neural spine was more likely used in courtship displays to threaten potential rivals or attract potential mates. And even though this drawer shows one such vertebrae, we unfortunately do not have the whole neural spine of Dimetrodon, but later on in the tour on the second floor we can take a look at another tetrapod called Edaphosaurus, who has a similar neural spine that we can take a look at. So the second tetrapod drawer here displays actually the bones of Dimetrodon. And so I'd like to first just briefly go over all the bones here. So we have the scapulocoracoid, which is its shoulder bone. And then we have the leg bones here. So the femur, which is the bones in the upper leg, the tibia, which is one of the bones in the lower leg, and here on the right we have the arm bones. So we have here the radius and the ulna, which are the bones in the lower arm. And then lastly we have the humerus, which is the funny bone, or the bone in the upper arm. And taking a look at the humerus and the scapulocoracoid, or the shoulder bone, we can just see how large and wide they are. Especially in the humerus here, we can also see that it's caved in here with very large areas that would have been where a lot of muscles would have been attached, allowing Dimetrodon to move efficiently. We can also see that the leg bones and the arm bones are relatively straight and slim, which also tells us that Dimetrodon was able to be more active on land. And so, another early tetrapod that actually also lived in the early Permian era is Eryops megacephalus. And here we're taking a look at the ventral view of its skull. And so it's basically the underside of the top of the skull. And we can see here the two eye sockets, as well as the teeth of the top of its jaw. And Eryops megacephalus lived in lowland habitats around ponds, rivers, and streams, similar to many other tetrapods who also lived near areas of water in order to minimize water loss. And its fossils are mainly found in early Permian era rocks of the Texas redbeds. And a little more about its name, Eryops means drawn out face. And we can see that this is a pretty accurate description, as most of the skull is in front of its eyes, giving the illusion of a really long face that is drawn out, and megacephalus means large-headed Eryops. So now I'd like to head upstairs to the second part of our tour, where we can take a closer look at the skull of Eryops as well as its teeth, and also take a look at its full skeleton. So here we are on the second floor of the Beneski, and as we can see here, we have a skull of Eryops megacephalus, except this time instead of the ventral view as we saw downstairs, it's the front or the top of the skull. And we can see here its two eye sockets, as well as its two nostrils here. And this hole in between the eyes was known as the pineal eye, which I will talk about shortly. But first, I just want to point out how large, broad, and flat the skull of Eryops was. And the eye sockets and nostril point roughly upwards, suggesting that Eryops megacephalus would basically sit stealthily in water with only its eyes and nostrils above water in order to catch its prey, similar to a modern crocodile. And now I want to talk a little more about the hole in between its eyes, which was a light-sensitive organ known as the pineal eye. And it would basically absorb light and thus tell Eryops' brain when seasons were changing, because it would be able to sense when days were getting longer and nights getting shorter, or vice versa. And thus it helped Eryops regulate a lot of its life cycles, such as the sleep and reproduction cycles, as well as thermoregulation. So now I want to talk a little more about its teeth and jaw, so we can see just how large Eryops' jaw was, and it had accessory fangs and really sharp teeth that helped it eat large fish and aquatic tetrapods. And the teeth had a folded pattern with enamel, which tells us that Eryops ate with an inertial feeding habit. And this is where, without any chewing mechanism, Eryops would instead throw its head back and up, like so, forcing its prey further back into its mouth, also similar to modern crocodiles and alligators. So now we can take a closer look at the full skeleton of Eryops. So adults grew up to 3 meters long and weighed up to 400 pounds, making it one of the largest land animals of its time. And what's interesting with the full skeleton is we can also see the bones that I introduced downstairs in context, but this time it's not Dimetrodon but Eryops. But nevertheless, we can still see the scapulocoracoid, or the shoulder bones, and then we can see the humerus, the funny bone, as well as the radius and ulna, the 2 bones in the lower arm, as well as the femur in the upper leg, and then lastly the tibia, the outer bone in the lower leg. And we can also see that Eryops, the hind legs, not only supported its weight but also helped with propulsion, and its pelvic girdle here was much larger than the simple plate found in fish. We can also see here that because the scapulocoracoid was so large and wide, it allowed for large muscle attachment to it, and the rest of the body attached closely to it. And we can also see that the shoulder bone is disconnected from the skull, which also helped Eryops move more efficiently. And we can also notice that the tail of Eryops was relatively short, which lets us know that it wasn't a very fast or efficient swimmer and was likely more efficient on land. And you probably noticed something funny about Eryops' posture in that it's sort of like a squatting posture, or sort of in push-up position. And this was very common of early land vertebrates. And most of its weight was actually used to just push its body off the ground. And because of the posture here, where it had its upper legs and upper arms extend nearly straight out from its body, we know that it moved in short, broad strides. And before I move on with the tour, I'd like to just take a quick look at another early tetrapod, Edaphosaurus. And we can see here that its backbone was composed of vertebrae that were here with long spines attached to it. And this is pretty similar to what the neural spine of Dimetrodon would have looked like. At this point though, you're probably wondering, how did we go from fish to tetrapods? The transition probably seems a bit extreme. And the answer is that there were transition species between fish and tetrapods. And one such transition species was Tiktaalik, which represented the rough midpoint between fish and tetrapods. And basically Tiktaalik, even though it lived in water, it already had really strong and large hind appendages. And basically, Tiktaalik's fossil was found in 2004 by a group of scientists led by Professor Neil Shubin from the University of Chicago. And when Shubin and the other scientists found Tiktaalik, they were quite surprised, because they thought that large hind appendages would only appear later on in animals that had evolved in land, as most fish had very large appendages in the front of their body, known as front-wheel drive, whereas tetrapods and other land animals had larger hind appendages at the back of their body, known as four-wheel drive. But Tiktaalik here showed that hind appendages were already beginning to evolve in organisms that lived in water prior to organisms that lived on land. And the pelvis of Tiktaalik was a unique mix of fish and tetrapod characteristics, suggesting that it evolved in a series of steps that scientists still don't fully understand. And scientists regard Tiktaalik as one of the most important transition species because it filled such a large gap in knowledge between fish and tetrapods, or the evolution from sea to land.